The sun came up slow over the Texas panhandle the way it always did in the deep of summer, like something reluctant and deliberate, like a man climbing out of bed who has already decided the day ahead holds nothing worth hurrying for. The sky moved through its changes without asking permission. Black first, then a bruised and heavy purple, then the raw burning orange that preceded the full heat. And by the time the first real light touched the flat cracked ground and threw long shadows westward across the pale grass, the air was already dry enough to sting the inside of a man's nose and tighten the skin across his knuckles. Jasper Doone had been awake for all of it. He sat at the small table near the east-facing window of his cabin with both hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had been hot when he poured it and was now something closer to room temperature, which in a Texas summer meant it was still too warm to be refreshing, but too cold to be useful. He had not drunk much of it. He held it the way a man holds something familiar in the dark, not for the thing itself, but for the sensation of holding something solid when everything else feels insubstantial. Outside the window, the land stretched away in every direction without apology, flat and enormous and pale gold in the early light, the grass thin and dry, the occasional scrub brush casting a shadow no wider than a man's hand. The sky above it was so large it felt less like a feature of the landscape and more like a condition of existence, something you could not get outside of, something that pressed down gently and permanently on everything beneath it. In winter that sky could be beautiful in a cold and indifferent way. In summer it was simply relentless, a vast white-blue furnace lid that sat overhead from sunrise to sunset and permitted no escape. Jasper had lived under that sky for 4 years. He had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. The cabin was modest in the way that honest poverty is modest without pretense or decoration. Every element of it present because it served a function and absent if it did not. One room perhaps 20 feet by 16 with plank walls that had been chinked and re-chinked against the wind and still let through a thin whistle on the worst nights. A cast iron stove in the corner with a small pile of wood beside it, unnecessary in this heat but kept ready from habit. A cot along the far wall with a wool blanket folded at one end, the fold precise in the way of a man who has spent time in military service and retained certain disciplines long after they ceased to be required. A shelf above the cot holding 3 books, a tin of tobacco he had not opened in 4 months, a small jar of nails, and a folded piece of canvas. A wooden chair at the table. A second wooden chair that sat against the wall near the stove and was not used. That was most of it. Most, but not everything. On the table beside the cooling coffee sat a photograph. Tin type the size of a man's palm, set in a small rectangular frame of plain dark wood. A woman and a boy both looking directly into the camera with the slightly startled solemnity that people wore in those days when having one's photograph taken was still an occasion, still a thing that required effort and stillness and a kind of formal acknowledgement that something permanent was being made. The woman was Ruth. She had brown hair pinned back from her face and a quality of steadiness in her expression that had nothing to do with passivity. It was the steadiness of someone who had looked at difficult things and decided not without struggle, but with finality, how she was going to respond to them. She was not smiling in the photograph because the exposure time required stillness, and smiling was hard to hold, but Jasper had known her for 8 years before she died, and he could see the shape of a smile in the set of her mouth, even in the photograph latent and ready, the way sunlight is present in a cloudy sky, even when you cannot see it directly. The boy was Owen. 6 years old in the photograph, small and dark-haired, with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and an expression of profound seriousness that was partly the requirement of the camera, and partly Jasper had always believed simply Owen's nature. Even at 6, the boy had looked at the world with a thoughtful gravity, as if he understood that things mattered and wanted to make sure he was paying sufficient attention. They had been dead for 2 years and 3 months. Jasper looked at the photograph the way a man looks at a scar on his own hand. Not with fresh grief, which has a particular rawness and urgency to it, a quality of emergency. With something older and quieter than that, the specific exhaustion that comes after grief has done everything it can do to a person, and left them standing diminished and bewildered, still drawing breath in a world that has become fundamentally smaller than it was before. Beside the photograph, so close that it was nearly touching the wooden frame, lay a piece of paper folded into quarters. The paper was old enough that the creases had gone soft, worn down by repeated folding and unfolding over years, until the paper at the fold lines was nearly translucent. You could see if you held it to the light that there was writing on the inside. Jasper did not hold it to the light. He had not unfolded it in months. He kept it on the table beside Ruth's photograph because putting it somewhere he could not see it felt like a different kind of lie than the one he was already living with, and he had decided years ago that he was done with that particular category of lie. He did not look at the paper this morning. He looked at his wife and his son, and outside the window the sky continued its slow, indifferent brightening, and the coffee in his cup went from too warm to cold. He had come to this land in 1869 with Ruth and Owen and 2 horses and a wagon loaded with what they could carry, which was not much, but was enough. The money had come from his Army separation pay, 8 years of accumulated back pay, and a disability compensation for the shoulder wound he had taken in the last months of the war. A wound that had healed imperfectly and still ached in cold weather, and occasionally reminded him of its existence when he lifted something heavy. $340 borrowed from a bank in Amarillo, operated by a man named Conrad Pell, at terms that had seemed reasonable to a man who was planning to build something on land that had water. The water was the reason for the land. A narrow stream ran along the northern edge of the property, fed by something underground that Jasper had never fully traced, something reliable and consistent that persisted even in the driest months of summer, when every other water source within 20 miles had gone to cracked mud and memory. It was not much of a stream. You could step across it without wetting your boots if you were deliberate about it. But in the Texas Panhandle in the summer of 1869, a strip of land with a reliable water source was the difference between land that could support life and land that was merely land. And Jasper had understood this, and so had Conrad Pell. And this shared understanding had formed the quiet foundation of a transaction that had seemed straightforward at the time. Ruth and Owen had died in the late summer of 1871. The cholera moved through the region that year with the particular efficiency of something that does not distinguish between the careful and the careless, the fortunate and the unlucky, the people who have reasons to live and the people who have run out of them. It hit Ruth first on a Tuesday evening when she had seemed perfectly well at supper, and it progressed with a speed that Jasper had not been prepared for, despite having some theoretical understanding of how the disease worked. He nursed her through 3 days that he did not afterwards like to think about in detail, days of a quality that belonged to a register of experience he had not known existed before then. She died on a Friday morning before the heat of the day had fully arrived, in a pale, quiet light that seemed indecent in its gentleness, given what it was witnessing. Owen was sick before Ruth was buried. He was smaller and had less to give, and it took him 4 days. Jasper sat with him through all of it, sleeping in the chair beside the cot in intervals so brief they barely counted as sleep-waking at every change in the boy's breathing. Owen died on a Tuesday evening, which meant that he had been alive for exactly 1 week after his mother and Jasper had held the boy's hand when it happened, and had noted with the strange clarity that extreme circumstances sometimes produce that Owen's hand was still warm for a long time afterwards, longer than seemed possible. He buried them both at the eastern edge of the property, where a slight rise in the flat ground gave a view of the sky in 3 directions, because Ruth had always said she liked to see the horizon. He built the markers himself, working carefully, taking more time than was strictly necessary, because the work gave his hands something to do, and his hands needed something to do. Then he stood alone in the cabin in the silence and waited for some feeling to arrive that would tell him what came next. No such feeling came, only the flat gray endurance that had over the following months and then years become the primary texture of his inner life. Not despair exactly, not acceptance either. Something between the two that had no clean name. A state of persistent going forward that was not quite living, and was not dying, and simply was what it was day after day in the heat and the dust and the enormous indifferent sky. He had thought about leaving. He had sat on the steps of the cabin on many evenings with a cup of something and thought about what it would mean to saddle up and ride east and not come back. There were places he could go, people who would take him in temporarily while he figured out what came after. There was nothing wrong with leaving except for the 2 mounds of earth at the east edge of the property and the fact that he could not make himself go further from them than the distance required to work the land. He had discovered this about himself on the first morning he saddled the horse with genuine intention to leave, and had sat on the horse for a long time at the edge of the property looking east, and had eventually unsaddled the horse and gone back inside. So he stayed. He worked the land because the land required working. He paid what he could on the debt to Pell, which was not enough, and was becoming less enough as the years wore on, and he watched the deadline approach the way you watch weather from a distance, with a recognition that is neither panic nor acceptance, but something in between. 47 days remained on the repayment schedule. After that, the bank held the right to claim the property against the outstanding debt, which Pell would certainly exercise, because Conrad Pell had not remained the most prosperous man in the Amarillo Basin by failing to exercise his legal rights when they became available to him. Jasper understood what losing the land would mean. Not only the practical loss of shelter and livelihood, though those were real enough. The other loss. The 2 mounds of earth. The markers he had built with his own hands. The distance from them that would become permanent if he left. He set the cold coffee down and rose from the table. He did not look at the folded paper. Outside, the morning was already committed to its heat, the air moving in that slow, heavy way of early summer that made the world look soft at the edges, slightly wavering, as if reality itself were reconsidering its own firmness. Jasper took his tools from the lean-to beside the cabin, the post driver and the wire stretcher and the leather gloves that had been resoled twice and were nearly through again, and he walked north toward the creek line where 3 fence posts had heaved out of the ground over the winter frost and still needed resetting 3 months later. He worked without hurrying. There was no other pace available to him alone in the heat, and he had learned long ago that hurrying at manual labor in a Texas summer was a way of making yourself sick without accomplishing anything additional. He worked steadily, the way water cuts stone, not through force but through persistence, one motion following another in a rhythm that his body knew without being told. The first post went in cleanly. He moved to the second. He was lifting the post driver for the third strike when movement caught the edge of his vision to the west and slightly south, low against the pale ground. He paused with the driver raised and looked. Something was walking toward him across the open ground. At that distance, perhaps 300 yards, it resolved slowly from an indistinct shape into something more specific. Upright. Small. Moving in the unsteady sideways drift of someone whose legs were no longer entirely under their own authority, whose body had been asked to continue past the point where continuation is physiologically reasonable and was doing so through something less substantial than actual strength. Jasper set the post driver down against the fence line. He did not reach for the rifle. He had leaned against the fence post behind him. He stood still in the building heat and watched the figure come toward him, and as the distance between them closed, he began to see the details. Small, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, dark hair loose and tangled, clothing that he recognized after a moment as Comanche-style traditional garments that had been reduced by whatever the child had been through to torn fabric stiff with dried sweat and dust. The walk was the walk of someone in the last portion of a long effort, each step a small, separate negotiation between intention and capacity. He began walking toward the figure. The space between them closed over the next minute and a half, both of them moving at the same slow pace, the heat pressing down on both of them equally without prejudice. When they were close enough that Jasper could see her face clearly, he stopped. A girl. Dark eyes that were large in a face that had been thinned by days without food and water. To a kind of stark clarity, the bones of her cheeks and jaw more prominent than they should have been on a child. Lips cracked white at the corners and dry and split in 2 places where they had bled and dried. She was trembling slightly, a fine continuous vibration that was the body's last effort to regulate itself when it has run out of other resources. She stopped when he stopped. She looked at him. Around her neck, on a cord of braided leather, hung a necklace of small beads. The beads were red and black, alternating in a careful pattern with a single larger bead at the center that had been carved into the shape of a running deer, small and precise, and worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. The workmanship was specific and intentional in a way that suggested it was not an ordinary piece of jewelry, but something made for a particular person, something that belonged to a particular life. Jasper looked at the necklace for a moment. Then he looked at the girl's face. Her expression was the expression of someone who has arrived at the end of something and does not have enough left in reserve to manage more than the arrival itself. Not fear exactly, though. Wariness was present underneath everything else. Not hope either, not yet. Something more basic than either of those. Simple animal presence, one creature before another too exhausted to perform any of the usual social calculations. Jasper crouched down until he was at her level. He kept his hands visible open at his sides, fingers spread in the instinctive gesture of demonstrated harmlessness. He spoke quietly in the tone he had once used with Owen when the boy woke frightened from a bad dream, calm and low and unhurried. "You're all right," he said. "I have water at the house." She did not understand the words. He had not expected her to, but she understood his hands open and still, and she understood the posture of a man who has made himself smaller in order to be less threatening, and she understood something in the quality of his voice that was not quite expressible in language, but communicated itself anyway, the way certain things do across the distance that words cannot cross. She did not step back. Jasper pointed at himself. "Jasper." He pointed toward the cabin. He mimed lifting a cup and drinking from it. Simple, visible, unmistakable. She looked at the cabin for a long moment. She looked back at him. Something moved across her face that was too complicated to name and too brief to examine, and then she began walking not toward him precisely but alongside him, maintaining a careful arm's length of distance that she held with the consistency of someone who has made a decision and intends to keep to it. She was stubborn about walking on her own. He noticed this immediately and did not offer to carry her, though there were several moments in the quarter-mile back to the cabin when her stride faltered badly enough that he moved his hand to her elbow ready, and she corrected herself each time through what appeared to be sheer force of will and kept going. Even in that condition, emptied out by days of heat and thirst and whatever she had been through before she arrived at his fence line, she was not going to be carried. He noted this as the first distinct thing he knew about her. Inside the cabin, he sat her in the wooden chair and moved to the stove. The porridge from the morning was still in the pot, cooled to room temperature. He added water and heated it gently while he poured water from the jug into a cup and brought it to her. She took it in both hands, and drank without stopping until it was empty. He refilled it. She drank that too, more slowly. He refilled it a third time, and she held it without drinking, the cup pressed against her lips, and he understood that she was finally getting ahead of the thirst and was now simply resting in the sensation of having enough. He did not speak while the porridge heated. He moved around the small cabin in the way he had learned to move in the years since Ruth died, quietly and without ceremony, performing the small practical tasks that constituted the maintenance of a life, and he let her sit and watch him and decide whatever she needed to decide about whether this place and this person were safe. When the porridge was warm enough, he brought it to her in the bowl with a spoon, and she ate. She did not eat with the frantic urgency of someone who has been starving for a long time. She ate steadily and carefully, as if she was paying attention to the food, and when the bowl was empty, she looked up at him with an expression that contained, buried under the exhaustion and the wariness, the beginning of something else. Something that would become trust, if trust turned out to be warranted. He put more in the bowl. She ate that too. The girl was fighting sleep by the time she finished eating, her eyelids dropping and snapping back open in the involuntary rhythm of a body that has decided it is safe enough to rest, and a mind that is not quite ready to agree. She lost the argument inevitably, the exhaustion finally heavier than the vigilance, and her eyes closed, and her breathing changed, and her head dropped forward slightly. Jasper moved to the shelf and took down the extra blanket. He stepped carefully toward the chair to drape it over her shoulders, and in doing so he reached across her to arrange the blanket and inadvertently moved aside the torn fabric near her collar, and he saw her wrists. He went still. Both wrists. The bruising was darkest on the right, a band of discoloration that wrapped around the small bones in a pattern he knew with a certainty that sat in his stomach like cold iron. He had seen that pattern before in circumstances he did not revisit willingly. It was the mark left by a hand gripping with the specific intention of restraint, gripping hard enough that the person being held could not pull free regardless of how much they tried. He stood very still beside the sleeping girl in the hot afternoon quiet of the cabin and looked at those bruises and felt the shape of what they meant assemble itself in his mind with a slow and terrible clarity. This child had not wandered here from a storm. She had not gotten lost on a hunting party and walked until she found water. Children who are lost stumble and fall and show it on their knees and hands and shins. They do not show it as matching bruises around both wrists in the pattern of human fingers. Someone had held her. She had gotten away or been let go or some third possibility that he could not yet see the edges of. She had walked across open ground in extreme heat without food or water and had arrived at his fence line and had let him bring her inside because she had no other option remaining. He laid the blanket across her gently. He stepped back. He stood in the middle of his small cabin with the afternoon light coming in hot through the single window and looked at the folded paper on the table beside his wife's photograph, and he felt something shift in his chest that was different from the flat gray endurance. Not panic, something colder and more precise. The feeling of a man who has just recognized that what he thought was a simple situation is in fact the visible surface of something much larger and much darker lying underneath. He pulled the chair at the table and sat down. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the sleeping child. He looked at the bruises on her small wrists. Outside, somewhere to the west, barely audible above the movement of the dry wind across the grass, a drum began. Slow and steady and deliberate, each beat separated from the next by an interval that gave the sound a particular quality, not the chaotic pulse of alarm, but the measured rhythm of intention. A sound that meant people were moving with purpose. Jasper wrapped his hands around the cold coffee cup. He did not drink. He waited. The drums faded sometime around midday and did not resume, and the silence they left behind was of a different quality than the silence that had preceded them. Before the drums, the quiet of the panhandle had been simply the absence of sound, the ordinary emptiness of a landscape with nothing in it. After the drums stopped, the quiet felt withheld, the way a room feels different when someone has just left it, the air still holding the shape of their presence. Jasper had gone back out to the fence line after the girl fell asleep, not because the fence was urgent, but because standing inside the cabin watching her breathe was not going to solve anything, and his hands needed occupation while his mind worked. He reset the third post and stretched the wire and walked the line in both directions, looking for other damage, moving slowly in the heat, letting his thoughts run where they needed to run. He was good at thinking about hard things without looking away from them. This was not a quality he had cultivated deliberately. It had been pressed into him over years of circumstances that did not permit the luxury of avoidance until it had become simply the way his mind operated, the way a muscle that has been used consistently becomes the natural first resort. He could look at an unpleasant truth directly and hold it in his attention and turn it and examine it from multiple sides without the examination itself becoming the problem. The unpleasant truth he was examining now had several sides. The first side was simple. A Comanche girl approximately 9 years old had arrived at his property in a condition indicating she had been without food and water for at least 2 days. The bruises on her wrists indicated she had been physically restrained by an adult within the last 24 hours. These two facts together did not support the narrative of a child lost in a storm. The second side was more complicated. If the girl was Comanche, she had people somewhere to the west who were looking for her. Those people, upon finding her at a settler's ranch, would not be inclined toward charitable interpretation. The history of this territory over the past decade did not produce that kind of instinct in either direction. What it produced was the reflexive assumption of the worst on both sides because the worst had been true often enough to function as a reliable baseline. The third side was the one that made his chest feel cold. The bruises had been made by someone. That someone was not Comanche, because a Comanche girl would not be restrained by her own people and then left to walk across open ground alone toward settler territory. The bruises came from a white man's hands, or more than one set of white hands, and they had been made recently, and the girl had ended up at his ranch, which was the nearest water source in this part of the Panhandle, because she had needed to survive, and survival required water. Someone had taken this child or led this child away from her people and held her, and then for reasons he could not yet see clearly, she had gotten free. And now she was asleep in his cabin, and her people were moving in the hills to the west looking for her, and any version of this situation that ended cleanly required an explanation that would have to cross the full width of everything that existed between these two peoples. He was still walking the fence line, moving slowly in the afternoon heat, when he heard horses coming from the east. 3 riders moving fast enough to raise a thin trail of dust behind them. He recognized all 3 before they pulled up, from the way they sat their horses, and the particular silhouettes they made against the eastern sky, the way you recognize people you have lived near long enough to know their shapes at a distance. Clem Briggs pulled up first. 50 years old, broad across the shoulders and thick in the middle, with a face that the weather had worked over until it had the texture of old leather and an expression of perpetual worry that had become so habitual it no longer indicated any specific anxiety, but simply the man's default relationship with existence. He had farmed 20 acres 2 miles east of Jasper's property since before Jasper arrived in the territory, and his wife Alma had been sick for 2 years with something the doctor in the nearest town called a weakness of the blood, and could not do more than name. Clem needed money for Alma's medicines, and he was not making enough from his land, and he was, as a consequence, in a state of permanent low-level desperation that made him careful about everything, careful and calculating in the way of a man who cannot afford to make mistakes. Frank Oates came in second, the deputy 35, and lean in a way that was less about physical constitution and more about a kind of internal economy. A man who spent nothing emotionally or otherwise that he did not calculate he could afford to spend. He wore his badge without particular pride or embarrassment, the way a carpenter carries his level as the tool most relevant to what he did. He was not dishonest. He was also not the kind of man who set his own interests at risk on behalf of principle, unless the principle was very clear and the risk very manageable. The Reverend came in last. Josiah Tunney, 60 years old, dismounting with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints have begun to lodge complaints that cannot be ignored. He had run the small church in the nearest settlement for 15 years, long enough that most people in the territory had stopped thinking of him as an individual and had begun thinking of him as a feature of the landscape, like the water tower or the feed store, something that had always been there and would presumably continue. Jasper had always suspected this was an inaccurate reading of the man. There was something in Tunney's eyes, some quality of attention that suggested a more complicated interior than the institutional role implied. What Jasper noticed now that all 3 had stopped was that Clem and Oates had not dismounted. "Jasper." Clem's voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has been rehearsing what he is going to say and has distilled it to the essential. "We have been watching smoke signals from the western hills since before noon. Frank has information." "Word reached my office this morning," Oates said. His tone was the professionally careful tone of a man presenting facts before they become accusations. "Chief Taka's daughter went missing 2 days ago, during the storm that came through on Sunday night. His search parties have been out since yesterday morning." He paused, his eyes on Jasper's face with the specific attention of someone reading rather than watching. "There is concern in my office about the current mood of Taka's band. 4 years of relative peace is not an unlimited resource. People on both sides have been watching for signs that it is ending." Another pause. "You have not seen anything unusual on your property." He said it in the way that can be a statement or a question depending on how the silence after it is filled. Jasper looked at the 3 men. He looked at Clem, whose worry had acquired a sharper edge than usual, the edge of something specific and immediate rather than the chronic general anxiety of a man in debt. He looked at Oates, who was holding himself very still on his horse in the manner of someone who has already decided several things and is waiting to see whether those decisions will need to be revised. He looked at Tunney, who was looking not at Jasper but at the cabin door with an expression that Jasper could not immediately categorize and that nagged at him for that reason. "She's inside," Jasper said. Clem closed his eyes. Not dramatically, not with visible emotion, simply the brief occlusion of a man absorbing a confirmation he had already prepared himself for, but had nonetheless hoped would not come. Oates made no physical expression at all. He sat very still on his horse. Tunney continued looking at the cabin door. "She walked onto my property this morning," Jasper continued, keeping his voice level and factual in the way you keep a blade level when you are doing precise work. "Half dead from thirst and several days without food. I brought her inside and fed her, and she's been sleeping since midday. I don't know whose daughter she is. I know she's a Comanche girl, and she was going to die if she kept walking in that heat, and I could not watch that happen." The silence that followed had the particular density of several people thinking fast about the same set of problems from different angles. Clem opened his eyes. The worry in his face had been joined by something else now, something that was not quite anger but occupied the same register. The frustration of a man who can see clearly how a situation is going to unfold and is powerless to alter the trajectory. "Jasper." He said the name the way you say the name of someone you are fond of who has just done something genuinely costly. "Do you understand what Taka's people are going to think when they find a missing Comanche girl at a white man's ranch? It does not matter what actually happened. What matters is what it looks like, and what it looks like is that you have his daughter. She walked here. That is not going to be the first interpretation." "Then I'll explain it." "You'll explain it." Clem said this without sarcasm, but with a heaviness that carried the weight of experience. To men who have been riding for 2 days looking for a child they believe has been taken. To men who are past the point where explanation lands the way it should. You're going to stand in front of 200 armed men whose chief's daughter has been missing for 2 days and explain. He shook his head, a slow movement that had resignation in it. "Jasper, I have known you for 4 years, and I know you are not a stupid man, so I'm going to ask you to hear what I am saying. This situation does not care about your intentions. It cares about appearances, and the appearance here is the worst possible one." Jasper said nothing. He had thought about this. Clem was not wrong. Oates cleared his throat in the specific way of a man moving to a prepared portion of what he had come to say. "I am required to report this. That is not a choice I have. What I can do is take some time before I file the formal report, time in which you might consider your options." He held Jasper's gaze steadily. "That is what I am able to offer." It was not much. They both understood this simultaneously and without needing to say so. Then Clem looked at Jasper, and what came into his face then was something more complicated than the worry or the frustration. It was a genuine pain, the pain of a man who is about to do something he knows is wrong and has found the reasons he is going to use to justify it and knows they are insufficient, but is going to use them anyway because he cannot see another way. "I don't want you dead," he said. "I need you to believe that is true. I am not leaving because I want to see you come to harm. I am leaving because I have Alma to think about, and I have my land, and I cannot put those things at risk. I am sorry that is the truth. But it is the truth." Jasper looked at his neighbor for a long moment. Clem was not a bad man. Jasper had known enough bad men in his life to distinguish them clearly from men who simply lived within a smaller circle of obligation than the situation required. "I know," he said. "Go home to Alma." Clem held his gaze for another second, the pain still present in his face, and then he turned his horse and rode east without looking back. Oates said, "I will give you what time I can," and followed. Jasper and Reverend Tunney stood in the heat and watched the two horses diminish eastward until they were small shapes in the shimmer of the afternoon air. Then Tunney dismounted, slowly, one leg at a time, with the deliberate care of a man negotiating a familiar limitation. He tied his horse to the post beside the cabin door and turned to face Jasper, and the expression on his face, now freed from the presence of the other 2 men, was the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has arrived at last at the place where the carrying ends. "I'm staying," he said. Jasper studied him. That could be dangerous, Josiah. Yes. The Reverend agreed without inflection, as if the possibility of danger was a factor he had already considered, and filed away. I imagine it could be. He looked toward the cabin. Show me the girl. Inside, the girl was still sleeping in the wooden chair with the blanket across her shoulders, her breathing slow and even. Tunney stood at a respectful distance and looked at her for a moment with an expression of careful attention. Then Jasper indicated the wrists, and Tunney looked at the bruising, and the careful attention on his face became something more complicated. He moved to the table and sat down in the second chair, Ruth's chair, and looked for a moment at the tintype photograph before looking at his hands folded on the table in front of him, the hands of a man pressing something down. "There is something I should have told you 3 weeks ago," he said. His voice was quiet and even. The voice of a man in a confessional, making himself say the thing that needs saying because the alternative has become more costly than the saying. "I have been working up to telling you, which is a way of saying I have been avoiding it, which is a way of saying I have been using uncertainty as a justification for cowardice." He looked up at Jasper. "I am 60 years old, and I have had sufficient practice at self-deception to recognize it when I am engaged in it, and I should have come sooner." Jasper sat down across from him. He was very still. 3 weeks ago," the Reverend continued, "I was riding back from the Hadley homestead the long way along the creek bed. Just before the bend where the creek turned south, I saw 2 men coming from the direction of Conrad Pell's property riding west." He paused. "Not ranch hands, not men you employ for the ordinary requirements of a working property. The kind of men whose particular usefulness lies in being willing to do things that ordinary men decline to do, and in not talking about it afterward. I have seen that kind in my life more than I would like. I know how they carry themselves." Jasper said nothing. "They were riding toward the hills," the Reverend said, "toward Taka's territory. I told myself I was making a connection that the evidence did not support. I told myself I was an old man with a pessimistic imagination." He looked at the bruises on the sleeping girl's wrists. "Those bruises tell me I was not making a connection the evidence did not support." The cabin was very quiet. A fly moved against the inside of the window glass in the aimless, persistent way of flies bumping and retreating and bumping again. "What do you think they were doing?" Jasper said. The Reverend was quiet for a moment, weighing his words in the manner of a man who has spent his life understanding that words once spoken cannot be taken back. "I think Conrad Pell is a patient man who has been watching this situation for a long time," he said at last. "I think he knows about the water on your property, and I think he has been waiting for the debt to expire, and I think that waiting has become insufficient for his purposes. I think he has begun to look for a faster resolution." He paused. "A serious conflict between the Comanche and the settlements in this area, a genuine disruption of the kind that frightens people badly enough to make them want to leave quickly and sell cheaply, would create a circumstance that a man in Pell's position could turn to considerable advantage. The army would be called. The territory would be declared unstable. Settlers would sell for whatever they could get, simply to leave safely, and a man with cash and legal paperwork who moved quickly could acquire land worth 10 times what he paid." Jasper looked at the sleeping girl. He looked at the shape of her wrists, the specific shape of human fingers pressed into skin. The whole picture assembled itself the way pictures do when you have had the pieces but not the arrangement all at once, and with a clarity that made the previous confusion seem willful in retrospect. "They took her," he said, "or they led her away from the hunting party, separated her from her people, left her somewhere she couldn't find her way back from." "I believe so." "And she ran, or she found a direction, and she walked until she found water." He looked at the Reverend steadily. "And she found my water, my ranch, the one piece of property that Pell has been waiting to take." He let the full weight of it settle before he continued. "If Taka believes a settler took his daughter, he doesn't distinguish between me and anyone else. He sees white men on land his people have known for 100 years, and he responds the way any father would respond. And in responding that way, he gives Pell exactly what Pell paid for." Reverend Tunney looked at him without flinching. "Yes," the Reverend said quietly. "I believe that is the shape of it." Outside, as if the land itself had been listening and had decided this was the moment to confirm what had just been spoken aloud, the drums started again. Not faint and distant this time. Close enough to be distinct, close enough that each individual beat was clear and separate, close enough to feel in the chest as much as to hear with the ears. The girl's eyes opened. Immediately, fully, the way the eyes open of someone who knows exactly what they are waking to. She sat up straight in the chair and turned her head toward the window and listened, and on her face was an expression that was not fear, but something adjacent to it. The expression of someone receiving information they were prepared for, but had hoped would arrive differently. She looked at Jasper. Then she looked at the Reverend. Then she looked at the door. Jasper looked at her wrists. He looked at the folded paper beside the photograph on the table, the paper he had kept for 4 years because destroying it felt like a different kind of wrong than the wrong that had created it, the paper that held a truth about himself that had never resolved into anything clean. He picked it up. He held it without opening it. He set it back down. The drums were closer now, and beneath them, threading in under the rhythm, was the sound that the drums had been preceding. The low building percussion of many horses moving across dry ground, the sound that carries further and different than any other sound across open terrain, impossible to mistake for anything else once you have heard it. Reverend Tunney looked at Jasper across the table. Outside, the afternoon light had taken on the particular golden quality of the hours before evening, the light that makes the Texas landscape briefly and painfully beautiful, all the harshness softened by warmth and angle, into something that looks for an hour like a place where good things might be possible. "What will you do?" the Reverend asked. Jasper was quiet long enough that the question had time to settle fully into the air between them. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the girl sitting straight in the chair with her hands folded in her lap, listening to the sound of her people coming. He looked at the folded paper. He thought about the bruises. He thought about Conrad Pell's patient, methodical, expensive patience. He thought about 47 days. "Tell the truth," he said. "All of it, whatever it costs." Tunney nodded once, the slow nod of a man who knows the cost of that answer and considers it the right one anyway. The hoofbeats were very close now. The golden light lay across everything. The cabin walls, the table, the old photograph, the sleeping child now fully awake and listening, and Jasper Doone sat in it and waited for the door of whatever came next to open, knowing that on the other side of it was a reckoning he had been building toward for 4 years without knowing it, a convergence of the thing he had done and the man he had been trying to become since. He stood up from the table. He picked up the folded paper and put it in his shirt pocket against his chest where it had never been before. Then he walked to the door and opened it. They came out of the west like weather. Not with noise, not with the war cries that settlers had learned to fear from campfire stories and newspaper accounts. They came in silence, which was worse. 200 men on horseback moving across the flat ground in the last golden light of afternoon, spreading wide across the landscape in a formation so disciplined and so deliberate that it communicated more clearly than any sound could have that these were not men acting from impulse. These were men executing a decision that had already been made by someone who had thought carefully about how it should be done. Jasper stood in the doorway of his cabin and watched them come. He had seen organized movement before. He had served 4 years in a war that had shown him what men looked like when they moved with collective purpose toward a specific end, and he recognized that quality now across the flat Texas ground in the amber light of late afternoon. The difference was that in the war he had been part of the movement. He had been one of the bodies in a line held up on both sides by other bodies, the collective mass providing a kind of insulation against the full weight of what was happening. Here he was, the point toward which the movement was directed, standing alone in a doorway with the Reverend behind him and a child at his back, and there was nothing between him and the full reality of the situation except whatever he carried inside himself. He did not reach for the rifle. He stood with his hands at his sides visible, and he watched them come, and he breathed steadily the way his old sergeant had taught him, in through the nose and out through the mouth, slow and even, because the body follows the breath, and a man whose body is calm can think when a man whose body is panicking cannot. They spread into a wide half-circle around the property as they approached, moving with the quiet efficiency of men who have done this before and know how it is done, filling the space between the cabin and the horizon in both directions until Jasper was standing at the center of a human arc that extended as far as he could see in either direction in the fading light. The war paint on the faces closest to him caught the last of the sun and held it red and black and ochre, the colors stark and declarative. Every man was armed. Every weapon was visible. None were raised. Not yet. At the center of the formation, directly in front of the cabin, perhaps 40 feet from where Jasper stood, a single rider stopped separately from the rest. He was not the largest man in the formation. He was not wearing more ornamentation than the others or carrying a more elaborate weapon. What distinguished him was something that could not be pointed to directly, a quality of stillness at the center of all that movement, the particular stillness of a man who is accustomed to being the point around which other things orient themselves. Chief Taka was 50 years old. He had a broad, dark face with deep lines at the corners of his eyes and mouth, the lines of a man who had spent decades looking at the horizon and thinking carefully about what he saw there. His hair was dark with silver, beginning at the temples, worn loose and long. He sat his horse without apparent effort, the way men sit horses when riding, and horses are not two separate things, but one continuous thing, the horse an extension of the man's intention rather than a vehicle for it. He looked at Jasper. Jasper looked at him. Between them, 40 feet of dry Texas ground, and everything that had ever happened in this territory between people who looked like Jasper and people who looked like Taka. From inside the cabin behind Jasper came the sound of small feet on the plank floor. The girl had come to the doorway. Jasper heard her stop just behind his right shoulder, and he heard the small, sharp intake of breath that was not quite a sound, but was the sound of recognition of a child seeing her father's face after days of not knowing if she would see it again. Taka looked past Jasper and saw his daughter. Something moved across his face then that Jasper would not have known how to describe to someone who had not seen it. Not relief, though relief was somewhere underneath it. Not rage, though that was present too. Something more primary than either of those. Something that existed below the level of the particular emotions a man can name in the register, where the body responds before the mind has organized its response. His hands, which had been loose on the reins, tightened once and then deliberately loosened again. The lines around his eyes deepened. He said something in Comanche. His voice was level and controlled. Whatever he said was directed at the girl behind Jasper, and the girl answered a few words, and he listened to them with his eyes closed for a moment that seemed longer than it was. Then he dismounted. He came forward alone, which Jasper understood was a statement. The 200 men behind him did not move, did not speak, held their positions with the disciplined stillness of men who take their cues from one source and are waiting for that source to tell them what comes next. Taka stopped at the cabin door. He looked at Jasper for a moment with an attention that was not hostile and was not friendly, and was simply complete, the full, unguarded attention of a man who is looking at something that matters and does not intend to miss anything. Then he looked at the girl. He reached out and put one hand briefly against her face, the quick, gentle touch of a parent confirming that a child is real and present, and then he looked back at Jasper. "Inside," he said. His English was deliberate and accented and precise, each word placed with care. Jasper stepped back from the doorway. The three of them moved into the cabin, Taka and Jasper and the girl and the Reverend, who was standing against the far wall with his hands visible and his face arranged into the careful, neutral expression of a man who is trying to be as small as possible. Taka glanced at him once, assessed him, and returned his attention to the room. He looked at the cabin the way Jasper had seen men look at places that tell them something. The single room, the worn furniture, the cast-iron stove, the shelf with its few objects, the cot with its precisely folded blanket, the table with the 2 chairs. He looked at the empty bowl where the girl had eaten. He looked at the blanket that had been draped over the chair where she slept. His eyes moved to the table and they stopped on the tintype photograph. He stood very still and looked at it. He looked at Ruth's face and at Owen's face and at the small rectangle of dark wood framing them, and he looked at the space around the photograph, the cleared and careful space of a man who treats certain things as worthy of particular attention. Beside the photograph, the folded paper was gone. Jasper had put it in his pocket. The silence in the cabin was the deepest silence Jasper had experienced since the morning after Owen died, the morning when the full weight of the absence settled in, and the world had seemed to be holding its breath out of something that felt absurdly like respect. Taka spoke without turning from the photograph. "Your family." It was not a question. "My wife and son," Jasper said. "They died 2 years ago. The cholera." Taka was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. Then he turned from the photograph and looked at Jasper directly, and in his face was the thing that Jasper had not expected to see there. Not the controlled fury of a man determining punishment. Something beneath the fury running underneath it like water under stone, older than the fury and more fundamental. "My wife died last winter," Taka said. He said it with the flat, factual tone of a man reporting something that is simply true, because some truths are too large for the voice to do anything with except state them plainly. "Sickness also." He looked at the girl who was standing near the stove, watching both men with the careful attention she had been maintaining since she arrived. "She is all I have remaining." The cabin held all of this. Jasper did not say he was sorry, because sorry was not the right size for what they were both looking at. He did not say anything. He let the silence do what silence does when two men are standing in the same place with the same kind of wound, which is different from what silence does in other circumstances, less empty and more present. It was Taka who broke it. "You fed her," not an accusation, a fact being confirmed. "Yes." "You gave her shelter." "Yes." Taka looked at him with an expression that was trying to become something definitive and had not yet managed it. The expression of a man who has arrived at a situation expecting it to be one thing and is finding it is another thing and has not yet decided what to do with the difference. "She tells me you saw her wrists," he said. "She tells me you looked at them and did not ask her questions." "I didn't need to ask questions," Jasper said. "I could see what made those marks." Taka held his gaze. "Tell me what you think made them." Jasper took a breath. "A grown man's hands. Both wrists, which means she was being held and tried to pull free. The bruising is recent, within the last day. It was not made by terrain or by accident." He paused. "It was not made by anyone in my house." Taka was very still. "I know who made it," Jasper said. "Or I know whose direction the order came from, even if I don't know the specific men. I need to tell you that, and I need you to hear all of it, because part of what I have to tell you is about me, and it is not easy to say, and if I don't say it now, there may not be another time." The girl spoke suddenly from her place near the stove. A short sentence in Comanche directed at her father. Taka listened and looked at his daughter, and then looked back at Jasper, and something in his posture shifted by a degree that was small, but visible the way a door shifts when the latch is disengaged even before anyone pushes it open. "She says you have the face of a man who has been waiting to say something true for a long time," Taka said. Jasper looked at the girl. She was watching him with those large dark eyes that had held fear and exhaustion when he first saw them, and now held something else, an attention that was considering him, that had been considering him since she arrived, with a seriousness that was unusual in a child, and that he had noticed from the beginning without fully naming. He reached into his shirt pocket. He took out the folded paper. He set it on the table between himself and Taka. "Before I explain what that is," he said, "I need to tell you about a man named Conrad Pell." Taka listened. This was the thing Jasper noticed first and kept noticing as he talked. Taka listened, the way very few people listen, with his full attention, committed his face, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, but simply receiving the way good ground receives rain, without prejudice and without waste. He did not interrupt. He did not shift his posture or look away. He simply listened, and Jasper talked, and outside the cabin, the 200 men held their positions in the falling dark, and the Reverend stood against the wall and said nothing, and the girl sat on the edge of the cot and watched her father's face. Jasper told him about Conrad Pell, about the land and the water and the debt and the 47 days. He told it without drama and without self-pity, as a sequence of facts that connected to each other in a logical chain, because Taka was not a man who needed drama and would likely have responded to self-pity by closing the door that had just opened slightly in his expression. He told him what the Reverend had seen 3 weeks ago, the two men riding from Pell's property toward the western hills. The quality of men, they were the kind of quality you recognize if you have been alive long enough and seen enough of the world to know what certain types of men look like before they do what they do. He told him what he believed had happened, that the girl had not been lost in the storm, that she had been taken from the hunting party or led away from it by men working for Pell with the purpose of creating a situation that would bring Taka's people and the settlers into conflict, that a conflict of sufficient severity would give Pell the disruption he needed to acquire land at distress prices, beginning with Jasper's water rights and spreading outward from there. Taka listened to all of this without expression. Then he looked at the folded paper on the table. Jasper looked at it too. He had carried it for 4 years. He had rehearsed explaining it many times in the privacy of his own mind in the late evenings when sleep would not come and his thoughts ran where they ran without his permission. He had never said it aloud to another person. The Reverend knew something about it, had heard rumors over the years that he had never directly addressed with Jasper out of a tact that Jasper had been grateful for and ashamed of simultaneously. In the spring of 1869, Jasper said, "I was not yet on this land. I had the money to buy it, but I had not yet come this far west. I was working for wages outside a town called Belton, doing what work I could find, and one of the things I found was a position with a group of men who described what they were doing as land surveying." He stopped. He looked at the paper. It was not land surveying. Taka waited. "There was an encampment," Jasper said. "A small one. Comanche families, not a war band. People making camp near a creek east of here, the creek at Elk Ridge. The men I was with had been hired to move through that area and encourage the Comanche presence to relocate. Those are the words they used. Encourage the presence to relocate." He kept his voice even. "What it meant was that we rode in while the men were away hunting, and we burned what we could burn, and we frightened the women and children, and we shot at anyone who ran in the wrong direction." The cabin was very still. "I did not fire my weapon," Jasper said. "I need to say that, but I also need to say that the saying of it does not change what I did, which was that I rode with those men, and I did not stop what happened, and I did not report it afterward. There was a man, an older man, who came back to the camp while it was happening, who would have been shot if I had not pulled him behind a water trough and kept him down until it was over. That is the only thing I did that I do not regret." He paused. "Afterward, the men who organized it had each of us sign a paper saying we would not speak about what occurred. I signed it because I was afraid, and because I told myself that signing was the only option I had, and both of those things were true, and neither of them makes the signing right." He unfolded the paper and laid it flat on the table. The writing was faded but legible. A date in March of 1869. Names. Jasper's name among them in his own hand. A brief statement of agreement to silence written in the formal, impersonal language of legal documents, which had the effect of making something shameful sound merely procedural. Taka looked at the paper for a long time. Then he looked up at Jasper, and his expression had changed, not to warmth, not to absolution, but the controlled fury that had been the baseline of his face since he dismounted and walked into the cabin had shifted into something more complex, something that had layers to it rather than a single clean edge. "The encampment at Elk Ridge," he said slowly. "In the spring of 1869. "Yes." Taka looked at the door. He said something in Comanche, not loudly, almost to himself. Then he looked at Jasper with an expression that Jasper would spend a long time afterward trying to fully understand. "There was a young man in that camp," Taka said, "the son of one of my sub-chiefs. He was not shot. He ran in the right direction." A pause that had something particular in it. "But his father was shot trying to return to the camp." Shot while he was on foot carrying water, not carrying a weapon. He let this sit in the air between them. That young man has ridden with me for 4 years. He is the one who has been most opposed to the peace I have tried to maintain. He has asked me many times why we do not strike back. I have told him that striking back will only make things worse. I have told him that the men who did this will be held to account by their own laws. He paused. I have told him this for 4 years. Jasper did not look away. I believe you understand, Taka said quietly, that I am about to bring you outside. At that moment the cabin door opened. Not violently, not dramatically. It opened the way a door opens when someone outside has been listening and has decided that what they have heard requires their presence. Stonehawk stepped inside. He was 26 years old, lean in the way of young men who move a great deal and eat what the land provides, with a face that had been angular from birth and had been further defined by years of wind and sun into something that looked carved rather than grown. He wore no war paint. He had not painted for this ride, which Jasper learned later was a deliberate statement, a refusal to participate in the ceremonial aspects of a conflict he considered to be past the point where ceremony was appropriate. His eyes were dark and direct, and he used them the way some men use words, with purpose and without waste. He looked at the paper on the table. Jasper watched him look at it. He watched the recognition move across Stonehawk's face, not of the specific document, but of what kind of document it was, the type and the purpose of it, and then the further recognition of the date and the name at the top and what those things meant. Stonehawk looked at Jasper. In the silence that followed, the sound of the night outside came into the cabin, the wind moving across the flat ground, the distant sound of horses shifting, the enormous quiet of the Texas Panhandle settling into darkness. Somewhere far off, a coyote spoke once and went silent. I know about this document, Stonehawk said. His English was less practiced than Taka's, but precise in its own way, the precision of someone who has learned a language for strategic reasons and has made it functional without making it comfortable. The Reverend told me of its existence 7 years ago. He did not know who had signed it. He looked at Jasper. Now I know. He said it without inflection. Jasper could not tell from the saying of it what Stonehawk intended to do with the knowing. Taka spoke to Stonehawk in Comanche. A long, quiet exchange followed, the kind of exchange between two people who know each other well enough to compress a great deal into a few words. The girl watched from the cot. The Reverend watched from the wall. Jasper stood beside the table with the paper in front of him and waited. When the exchange ended, Stonehawk looked at Jasper again. My father was the man you pulled behind the water trough, he said. The words landed in the room and did not move. My father did not die that day. Stonehawk continued, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man reciting something he has recited to himself many times and has learned to recite without breaking. He died 2 years later. He was sick after that day with something inside him that the healers could not reach. He died without telling me what the sickness was. But I knew. He paused. Some things do not need to be spoken to be understood. Jasper stood with all of this. You saved his life that day, Stonehawk said. And then you signed a paper to stay silent about everything else that happened. He looked at the document on the table. I have asked myself for 4 years what I would do if I ever found one of the men from Elk Ridge. I thought I knew the answer. Outside, from somewhere in the half-circle of waiting men, a voice called out in Comanche. The voice was not calm. It had the particular edge of impatience in it of men who have been waiting in the dark for a long time for a conclusion that has not come. More voices joined it. Stonehawk turned toward the door and called back a single short sentence that silenced the voices temporarily but did not resolve them. When he turned back to the room, his face had acquired a new quality, the quality of a man managing several things simultaneously and finding the management difficult. There are men out there, he said to Taka, who came tonight expecting blood. They have been riding for 2 days. They are tired and angry, and they came here with a purpose, and they have not yet seen that purpose served. If we walk out of this cabin without resolution, without something they can understand as justice, I cannot answer for what some of them will do. He looked at Jasper. I am not threatening you. I am telling you how things stand." Jasper looked at Stone Hawk. He looked at the young man's face, and he saw the thing in it that he had not been able to see from the outside, the thing that the flatness of his delivery had been covering since he walked through the door. It was not hatred. Hatred is clean and simple, and Stone Hawk was not a simple man. What was in his face was something much harder to sit with than hatred, a grief that had been living as rage for so long that the two things had become difficult to separate. A grief that had never been given its proper shape, because grief requires a level of acknowledgement that this young man had never received from the world that had caused it. The girl moved. She had been sitting on the cot watching everything with those evaluating eyes, and now she slid off the cot and crossed the small cabin floor and stood between Stone Hawk and Jasper, which was not a large distance, but was the right distance for what she was doing. She looked up at Stone Hawk, and she began to speak. She spoke in Comanche, and she spoke for a long time, longer than anyone in the cabin expected her to speak, and she did not speak with the hesitancy of a child finding her words. She spoke with the fluency of someone who has been composing something in her mind for hours and is now delivering it. Taka began translating in a low voice, not interrupting the girl but running just behind her words like a shadow. She was telling Stone Hawk what had happened to her. Not the practical facts, the being taken and the being held and the running, though those were in it. She was telling him what it had felt like to be alone in the dark, and the heat with no water and no direction, and the certainty growing in her that she was going to die there. She was telling him about arriving at the fence line of this ranch and seeing a man who could have sent her away, or worse, and did not. She was telling him about the water and the food and the blanket and the way this man had moved around the cabin without speaking, giving her space to decide whether she was safe. She was telling him that she had watched this man's face when he found the marks on her wrists, that she had watched him understand what the marks meant and say nothing, and cover her with a blanket and sit down at the table and look at a photograph of his dead family with an expression that she recognized because she had seen a version of it on her own father's face since her mother died. She looked at the tin-type photograph on the table, and she said something, and Taka's translation came a beat behind her. She said that this man's grief and Stone Hawk's grief were made of the same material, that both griefs came from the same source, from men like the ones who had sent people out to hold a child by the wrists in the dark, men who moved through the world using other people's pain as a resource. She said that if Stone Hawk took Jasper's life tonight, he would be giving those men exactly what they wanted, because the story that would be told afterward would be the story they needed told, and the land would fall, and the water would be taken, and the people who had engineered the whole thing would sit in their offices in Amarillo and be satisfied. She was 9 years old. She stopped speaking. The cabin was very quiet. Stone Hawk stood with his eyes on the middle distance, not looking at Jasper or at the girl or at his chief, looking at something internal, something he was examining with the same directness he brought to everything. Outside, another voice called from the darkness. Impatient and hard-edged, the voice of someone running out of willingness to wait. Stone Hawk took a long breath. He looked at Jasper with the full, committed attention he had brought to everything since entering the cabin. "The paper," he said. "What were you going to do with it?" Jasper looked at the document on the table. "I was going to find a way to make it count for something," he said. "I did not know what that way was. I have been looking for it for 4 years. Stone Hawk was quiet for a long moment. "There are men outside," he said finally, "who need to understand what happened tonight. Not just that the chief's daughter was found. They need to understand who actually put her in danger. If they do not understand that if they go home tonight thinking that the white man's ranch is where the threat came from, nothing is resolved. The next thing that happens, Pell or someone like him does something else, and there is another night like this one, and eventually one of those nights ends differently." He looked at Taka. He spoke in Comanche, brief and direct. Taka listened. He looked at Stone Hawk for a long moment with the expression of a man who is recalculating something he thought was settled, and finding that the recalculation leads somewhere he had not anticipated and is not entirely sure he is prepared for. Then he looked at Jasper. "There is something that needs to happen outside," Taka said, "and it requires something from you that may be harder than what you have already done in this room." He looked at the document on the table. "All of it," he said, "in front of my people. Everything you told me in here." The night outside pressed against the cabin walls. The voices of the men in the dark had gone quiet again, but the quiet was the kind that precedes rather than follows the held breath before the word is spoken. Jasper looked at the paper. He looked at Taka. He looked at Stone Hawk, who was watching him with an expression that was not demanding and was not forgiving, and was simply waiting with the patience of someone who has decided to see what a man is actually made of before deciding what to do about it. He picked up the document. He folded it and placed it back in his shirt pocket against his chest. Then he walked to the cabin door and opened it, and the Texas night came in, and beyond the doorway the shapes of 200 men on horseback were darker than the darkness around them waiting. The night air hit Jasper's face like something solid. Not cool, not in Texas in the summer, but different from the air inside the cabin, carrying the smell of horses and dry grass and the particular mineral quality of the panhandle earth after a hot day, a smell that had become over 4 years as close to the smell of home as anything he had. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping fully outside, not from hesitation, but from the specific deliberateness of a man who understands that the next few minutes will be of a type that does not allow for correction afterward. You do not get to revise what you say in front of 200 men in the dark. You say it once, and what you say is what you are. He stepped outside. Taka came out behind him, and then Stonehawk, and then the Reverend, moving with the careful quiet of a man who knows he is peripheral to what is happening and intends to remain so. The girl came last, standing just outside the doorway, and the sight of her produced a sound from the assembled men that was not quite a sound, but was the collective release of something held 200 men breathing differently at the confirmation that she was there and whole and standing on her own feet. The formation had not moved. The half-circle of horsemen stretched away into the darkness in both directions, the nearest men close enough that Jasper could see their faces in the thin moonlight, the further ones fading into shapes, and then into the suggestion of shapes, and then into the darkness itself. Directly in front of him, at the head of the formation, several senior warriors sat their horses with the stillness of men who have been informed that what happens in the next few minutes will require their attention. One of them was not still. He was perhaps 30 feet from Jasper on a dark horse that shifted and stamped with the nervous energy of its rider, and he had the face of a man who has been waiting for a verdict and has decided in the waiting that he already knows what the verdict should be. Jasper did not know his name yet, but he recognized the type immediately, not because there was malice in the face, but because there was a particular kind of grief in it that he had seen before, in men pushed past the point where reasoning reaches them, the grief that has calcified into something harder and more dangerous than grief, because hardness is the only way the man has found to keep moving forward. Taka spoke. He spoke in Comanche, standing at Jasper's left side, his voice carrying across the assembled men with the ease of someone accustomed to being heard across distances. He spoke for perhaps 2 minutes without pause, and while he spoke, Jasper stood beside him and looked out at the assembled faces, and understood nothing of the words, but read what he could from the faces of the men who did understand them. Some of the faces shifted toward something more considered as Taka spoke. Others held their positions, the controlled anger unchanged, waiting for something specific before they would commit to a different response. When Taka finished, he turned to Jasper and spoke quietly in English. "I have told them that my daughter was not taken by this man. I have told them that she came to this ranch under her own power and was given food and shelter and was treated with care. I have told them that the threat to my daughter came from a different direction entirely." He paused. "Now I need you to tell them what you told me in the cabin, your part of it, in your own words. I will translate." Jasper looked out at the assembled men. He thought about what it meant to say certain things in front of witnesses. There were things you could carry privately, things that lived only inside you, and cost only you, and there were things that required witness to become what they needed to become. He had understood this in an abstract way for 4 years. He understood it in a very concrete way now. He began to speak. He spoke slowly enough that Taka's translation could follow him without losing anything. He did not speak loudly. He spoke at the volume of a man having a direct conversation with specific people, and the night was quiet enough that his voice carried further than a shout would have in a noisier place. He told them about Conrad Pell. Not the way he had told Taka inside the cabin with explanation and context and the careful unpacking of how one thing led to another. He told it the way you tell something to men who have been waiting in the dark for a long time and deserve to have it said plainly and without ceremony. The land, the water, the debt. A man in Amarillo who had decided that other people's property was his to arrange and had been patient about it until patience ran out. He told them about the Reverend's testimony. 2 men riding west from Pell's property 3 weeks ago, the direction they were riding and what that direction meant. He told them about the bruises on the girl's wrists and what those bruises told him and whose hands had made them. He did not describe the bruises again. The girl was standing 10 feet away. Anyone who needed to understand what had been done to her could look at her wrists in the moonlight and understand it without his help. He told them that the purpose of all of it was conflict, that Pell needed fire and did not care which end it was lit from, only that it burned. He stopped. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the folded paper. He unfolded it and held it up where the moonlight caught it. Then he told them about Elk Ridge. He told it the same way he had told Taka, with the same level voice and the same refusal to mitigate or excuse, because the men listening to him deserved the same version that Taka had received. He told them what had happened and what he had done and what he had failed to do. He told them about the man he had pulled behind the water trough and about the paper he had signed afterward and about the 4 years he had carried the paper without knowing what to do with it. He did not tell it as a confession seeking absolution. He told it as a man presenting evidence, relevant evidence, evidence about himself, and about the mechanisms by which men like Pell operated, and about the long chain of small failures and cowardices and silences that added up over time to something that looked like policy and functioned like weapon. When he finished the night, held everything he had said without returning it. Taka had been translating throughout in a steady voice, and when the translation concluded, the silence that followed had a different quality than the silences that had preceded it. Not the silence of men waiting for something to be decided, the silence of men who are already deciding. The man on the dark horse, the one who had not been still, was very still now. Jasper looked at him directly. He could see the man's face clearly enough in the moonlight to see the calcification cracking the way ice cracks when the temperature shifts not all at once, but in a spreading pattern from some point of initial fracture. It did not look like comfort. It looked like pain. Actually, the particular pain of someone who has been holding a position for a long time and is beginning to feel the cost of the holding. Stonehawk moved to stand beside Jasper. He spoke in Comanche directed at the man on the dark horse, and the words were brief, and they were not gentle, but they were not an attack either. They were the words of one man speaking to another across the specific distance of shared grief, acknowledging the grief without pretending it was simple or that it should be otherwise. Jasper could not understand the words, but he heard the register of them, and he understood their function, which was not to resolve what the man on the dark horse was feeling, but to tell him that his feeling was known and was not being dismissed. The man on the dark horse looked at Stonehawk for a long time. Then he looked at Jasper. He said one thing in Comanche, one sentence. His voice was low enough that Jasper could not hear it clearly, and even if he had, he would not have understood the words. Taka translated quietly, leaning slightly toward Jasper. He says that a man who has been carrying his own testimony against himself for 4 years is either very honest or very stupid. Jasper waited. He says he thinks you are honest, Taka said. He says he will decide about stupid later. It was not forgiveness. It was not the resolution that a different kind of story would have provided, the clean and satisfying resolution where understanding produces immediate peace and everything terrible is retrospectively redeemed. It was something more modest and more real than that. It was the beginning of a space in which something other than violence could occur. That was enough. For now, it was enough. Reverend Tunney exhaled slowly beside the cabin wall, the long, careful exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for longer than he realized. Taka spoke to the assembled men, a longer address, now his voice carrying the cadence of a leader moving through something with his people rather than deciding something for them. As he spoke, Jasper watched the faces in the moonlight and saw what he could see, which was not everything, but was sufficient. The hard edges were not gone. The history that had produced them was not gone. But something had moved in the room, which was not a room, but an open night under stars, and the movement was perceptible. When Taka finished, he turned to Jasper. "I have told them what must happen next. There are 4 of my senior men who will ride to Amarillo tonight. Not to make war, to make record, to give testimony in whatever forum will receive it about what was done to my daughter and by whose direction." He looked at Jasper steadily. "That document you are holding will be part of that testimony." Jasper looked at the paper in his hand. "Yes," he said. The riders left within the hour. 4 of Taka's senior men riding east in the dark toward Amarillo, carrying in their memory the account of what had been said, and in one man's saddlebag a sealed letter that Reverend Tunney had written at the cabin table by lamplight, writing quickly with the focused efficiency of a man who has been preparing this letter in his mind for 3 weeks and needs only to render it into physical form. The letter described what he had witnessed 3 weeks ago. It described the 2 men riding west from Pell's property. It described this night in detail the condition in which the girl had arrived at Jasper's ranch, the bruising on her wrists, the account Jasper had given. The Reverend had signed it with his full name and his title, and he had not hesitated over the signing. The 4 riders disappeared into the darkness, and the sound of their hooves faded into the general quiet of the Texas night, and with their departure, something in the assembled formation shifted. Men who had been there for a purpose had now been given a different purpose, and the energy that had been oriented toward one kind of resolution reorganized itself around another. Not peacefully, not simply, not without the residue of everything that had brought them here, still present in faces and postures, and the set of hands on weapons that had not been fully lowered. But differently. Taka spoke to the men for several minutes more, then by ones and twos and small groups they began to move. Not with the dramatic unison of their arrival, but with the quieter dispersal of men who have received instruction and are implementing it, some riding west toward the hills, others making camp at a respectful distance from the property. A handful of the senior men remaining near the cabin in a way that was not a threat but was a presence, a statement that this was not concluded but was paused and watched and taken seriously. The man on the dark horse was one of the last to move. He sat for a long moment after the others had begun to disperse, looking at Jasper across the dry ground, and Jasper looked back at him without looking away. Then the man turned his horse and rode west, and the darkness received him. Stonehawk had not moved. He stood near the cabin door, slightly apart from everyone else, and when the last of the dispersing men had cleared the immediate area, he walked toward Jasper and stopped. He did not look the way he had looked inside the cabin when he was managing several things at once and holding himself level under the weight of all of them. That management was gone now. What was in his face in the thin moonlight was something rawer than management, the face of a man who has spent years building a wall around a specific wound and has just watched someone walk through the wall without forcing it, simply by standing still and telling the truth. He was not sure what to do with that. Jasper could see him not being sure and did not look away from it, because Stonehawk had not looked away from anything tonight and did not deserve to have it done to him now. Between them was the full weight of Elk Ridge and the paper and the water trough and the 4 years of carrying all of it present without being spoken. "I told you I thought I knew what I would do if I found one of those men," Stonehawk said. "You did?" "I was wrong about what I would do." He said it without apparent surprise, as if discovering that you are wrong about yourself is simply a thing that happens and should be noted without drama. "I thought knowing would be enough. I thought having the name and the face would complete something." He paused. "It does not complete anything." Jasper said nothing. There was nothing to say to that which would not make it smaller than it was. "My father died," Stonehawk said. "He is not less dead because you pulled him behind a water trough. He is not less dead because you signed a paper and felt badly about it for 4 years. He looked at Jasper with eyes that held nothing back and nothing forward, simply the present reality of what was true. But he might be more dead if you had not pulled him behind the water trough. There might have been less time and I might have had less of him. That is also true. He was quiet for a moment. I do not know what to do with two true things that pull in different directions, he said. I have never known what to do with that. I thought there was always one true thing and the work was to find it. He looked at the night sky briefly and then back at Jasper. You are telling me there are two. Usually more than two, Jasper said. Stonehawk considered this. Then he did something that Jasper had not expected. He reached out and placed his hand on Jasper's left shoulder briefly, the weight of it firm and real, and then gone. Not a handshake, not an embrace. The specific gesture of a man acknowledging another man's presence in a way that costs something to give. Then he walked away into the dark. Jasper stood where he was for a moment, feeling the place on his shoulder where the hand had been, and then he turned back toward the cabin. Inside, Taka was sitting at the table. The girl was asleep again on the cot this time, with the deep, unguarded sleep of someone who is genuinely safe, rather than simply too exhausted to remain vigilant. The Reverend was at the stove heating water for coffee with the quiet, purposeful movements of a man doing something practical because something practical needs doing. Jasper sat down across from Taka. For a while neither of them spoke. The lamp burned low on the table. Outside, the sounds of the dispersed men were fading into the broader sounds of the night. The coffee water began to heat. Pell will not let this go, Jasper said finally. My testimony and your writers and the Reverend's letter will slow him down. Maybe stop him if the right people in Amarillo decide they are more afraid of the legal exposure than they are motivated by his money. But men like Pell have many ways of applying pressure. This is not finished. Taka nodded once. He had been thinking the same thing Jasper understood. It was why he was still sitting at this table in the middle of the night instead of riding west with his men. There is a man in Amarillo, Taka said. A lawyer. He is not old, but he is competent, and he is not owned by Pell, which in Amarillo is rarer than it should be. My people have used him before when legal questions required someone who knew the forms. He paused. If you had a lawyer filing on your behalf and my people filing on our behalf, and the Reverend's letter as a common foundation, the shape of what Pell has done becomes visible in a way that courts are required to look at. Jasper looked at him. You would do that. My daughter is alive, Taka said. The three words carried everything that needed to be carried. They were not an expression of gratitude exactly, though gratitude was in them. They were a statement of account of the specific weight of a specific thing delivered by a man who measured weight carefully and did not misrepresent what he was measuring. Jasper looked at the photograph on the table. Ruth's steady face. Owen's serious eyes. There is still the question of the debt, he said. 47 days. If Pell is removed from the picture, the debt still exists. The bank still holds the right to the property. The bank exists because Pell built it, Taka said. Remove Pell and the bank has different questions to answer about how its loans were structured. He allowed a pause that contained something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same space. My lawyer is very good at asking questions about how loans were structured. The Reverend brought 2 cups of coffee to the table and sat down in the third chair with his own cup, and the 3 men sat together in the low lamplight while the Texas night moved through its hours toward morning. There was something that needed to be said, and Jasper had been working toward it throughout the evening without quite arriving at it, approaching it, and then finding a reason to approach some other thing first. He recognized the behavior for what it was. He had been practicing it for 4 years with the folded paper. I need to ask you something, he said to Taka. And I need to ask it directly because there is not a sideways version of it. Taka set his cup down and waited. Stonehawk's father, Jasper said. The man at the water trough. I pulled him down, and I kept him down, and I did not fire my weapon, and I signed the paper, and I left. And I have told myself that what I did not do matters as much as what I did, and sometimes I have believed that, and sometimes I have not. He paused. I need to know if there was something else I could have done. I need to know what it would have looked like to do more than I did. Not so that I can feel better about the past. Because if another situation comes that looks like that one, I need to know the answer before it arrives. Taka looked at him for a long time. You were young, Taka said. You were afraid. You had no standing among those men, no authority to stop them. He paused. You could have reported it afterward to someone with the power to act on it. You did not. You signed the paper instead. Yes. That is the answer to your question. He said it without judgment and without mercy, simply as the answer, because Jasper had asked for the answer, and Taka was a man who gave people what they asked for when what they asked for was the truth. The thing you could have done differently is the thing you already know you could have done differently. You did not need me to tell you that. No, Jasper said. I did not. What you needed, Taka said, was to say it in a place where someone who had the right to hear it could confirm that you are correct. That is a different need than not knowing. Jasper looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the sleeping girl on the cot, breathing slowly in the safety of the small cabin. Yes, he said. That is a different need. The Reverend said nothing. He drank his coffee and looked at the table and was present in the way that certain people are present, not as a contributor but as a witness, which is its own kind of necessary. They sat together for another hour. They talked about Pell, about what the riders would find in Amarillo, and what legal landscape they would be navigating, about the Reverend's letter and what weight it would carry from what source. They talked practically and specifically the way people talk when they are making a plan rather than making a story, and by the time the first gray light began to show at the eastern edge of the sky, they had the outline of something that was not a guarantee but was a direction. Outside, one of the remaining Comanche men called something to Taka from a short distance away, a brief report, and Taka called back something brief in return. He looked at Jasper. Riders approaching from the east. 3 horses. Jasper went to the window. In the gray pre-dawn light, 3 shapes were coming across the flat ground from the direction of Amarillo. As they came closer, he could see that the lead rider was Clem Briggs, sitting his horse with the posture of a man who has ridden hard and is tired and is riding anyway. Behind him was Frank Oates on his bay. And behind Oates was someone Jasper did not immediately recognize, a younger man, slight in a dark coat, sitting his horse with the careful, upright posture of someone not entirely accustomed to riding long distances. Clem pulled up outside and dismounted and tied his horse and stood for a moment looking at the several Comanche men visible in the gray light around the property, and his face showed something moving through it that resolved after a moment into a decision being made and held. He walked to the cabin door and knocked. Jasper opened it. Clem looked at him. He was tired, and his face showed it, the particular tiredness of a man who has not slept, and has ridden hard, and has been having an argument with himself for several hours about whether what he is doing is right, and has not entirely resolved the argument, but has decided to act anyway. I left, he said. I know I left. I'm not going to pretend that was something other than what it was. I know what it was, Jasper said. I got about 4 miles east, Clem said. And I thought about Alma. I thought about how she would want me to act in this situation if she were well enough to have an opinion, which she is not. And I thought about what I would tell her when she asked me how this turned out, because she would ask me because she is that kind of woman. He stopped. So I went and got Frank. And Frank knew about a lawyer in Amarillo that Taka's people have used, young man named Marcus Webb. And I rode to his house at 2 in the morning and I knocked on his door. The young man in the dark coat had dismounted and was standing behind Clem with a leather case under his arm and the alert, assessing expression of someone who has been woken in the middle of the night and given a complicated situation and has decided that the complexity is not an obstacle but an interest. Marcus Webb, the young man said, looking past Clem at Jasper and then at Taka, who had appeared at Jasper's shoulder. I understand there is a situation that requires legal attention before certain parties in Amarillo have the opportunity to define it on their own terms. Taka looked at him for a moment. You have represented my people before. I have, Webb said, and I intend to do so again, But first I need to understand what I'm working with." He looked at the document in Jasper's hand, the one he was still holding, the one he had been holding for the better part of the night. "I believe that may be part of it." Jasper handed him the paper. Webb unfolded it. He read it in the gray early light with the careful focus of someone reading a legal document, which it was, and then he read it again, and when he looked up, his expression had the quality of a man who has just seen the shape of a large thing and is organizing his understanding of it. "This is signed by Jasper Doone," he said. "Yes," Jasper said. "And you are Jasper Doone?" "Yes." "And you are giving this to me voluntarily?" "Yes." Webb looked at the document once more, then he folded it carefully and placed it in his leather case with the precision of someone handling something that has specific value and should be treated accordingly. "Conrad Pell has been operating in this territory for 11 years, he said. "In those 11 years he has accumulated property through methods that I have suspected for some time were not uniformly legal. I have not had sufficient evidence to do anything about those suspicions." He patted the leather case. "I believe that has changed." Nobody heard the fourth horse until it was already at the edge of the property. Not hooves on hard ground, not the creak of saddle leather. What they heard first was a voice carrying across the pre-dawn gray with the particular carrying quality of a man who has spent decades giving instructions to people he expects to obey them. "Doone." One word. The way you say a name when the name is the entirety of what you need to say. Jasper turned. Conrad Pell sat his horse at the northern edge of the yard alone, which told Jasper immediately that this was not a planned confrontation. Pell had ridden out himself in the dark without waiting for the men he usually sent ahead of him. He was a broad man, well fed in the way of men whose prosperity is old enough to have settled into their bodies with a face that had the quality of something maintained rather than naturally preserved. He wore a good coat. He held his reins with the easy authority of a man who has never had to grip anything tightly because things have always come to him without struggle. He was looking at the Comanche men stationed around the property. He was looking at Taka. He was looking at Marcus Webb standing in the doorway with the leather case under his arm. The calculation happening behind his eyes was visible the way a fire is visible through a window at night. You cannot see the fire directly, but you can see its light moving on the walls, and you know from the quality of the light that the fire is large. Pell looked at Jasper. "I came to discuss the terms of your debt," he said. His voice had not changed. It still carried the practiced ease of a man who has always been the one setting terms. "I believe there may be room for an arrangement." Jasper said nothing. "The current situation," Pell continued, his eyes moving briefly to the assembled Comanche men and back, "seems to have created some confusion. I am prepared to be generous. The debt can be restructured, extended. Under circumstances like these, a man in your position should be glad to have options." Webb stepped out of the doorway and walked forward until he was standing at Jasper's shoulder. He was half Pell's age and a third of his weight, and he looked at the older man with the calm, focused attention of someone who has just been handed exactly what he needed and is being careful not to show how much he needed it. "Mr. Pell," Webb said. "Marcus Webb. I represent Mr. Doone in the matter of the debt you mentioned, and additionally in a related matter concerning the disappearance of Chief Taka's daughter 3 days ago." He opened the leather case. He did not take anything out. He simply opened it. "I wonder if you would be willing to answer a few questions about 2 men who were seen leaving your property riding west approximately 3 weeks ago." Pell looked at the case. He looked at Taka, who had moved to stand on Jasper's other side, not speaking, not gesturing, simply present in the way that 200 men somewhere in the dark behind him were present. He looked at Frank Oates, who had come around from the far side of the cabin at some point in the last minute, and was now standing slightly to Pell's left with his thumbs in his belt and his badge catching the first gray suggestion of dawn light. The calculation behind Pell's eyes ran its course. Whatever it produced it quickly. The ease went out of his posture, the way ease goes when a man understands that the thing he came to handle has already been handled, and not by him, and that the handling has produced a situation he did not plan for and cannot now redirect. He did not speak again. Oates stepped forward. He did it with the mechanical certainty of a man performing a function that has become in the last several hours unambiguous. "Mr. Pell," he said, "I am going to need you to come down off that horse." The sun was not yet up, but the sky to the east had begun its first pale suggestion of the day ahead, and in that thin, early light, Conrad Pell dismounted from his horse on Jasper Dunes property, and the thing he had spent 11 years building in the Amarillo Basin began in that moment to come apart. Clem was still standing in the doorway looking at Jasper. The argument he had been having with himself was still visible in his face, not resolved but present, the face of a man learning to live with having been wrong and having come back anyway, which is a different and more complicated thing than simply having been right from the beginning. "I couldn't leave it," he said, "not as an explanation. As a statement of something discovered the way you state something you have learned about yourself that you did not know before." "No," Jasper said. "I know the feeling." The sun came up. It came up the way it always did over the Texas Panhandle, without asking anyone's permission and without caring what it found when it arrived. The darkness pulled back from the eastern edge of the sky, the way water pulls back from a shore slow and inevitable, and what replaced it was not the dramatic color of storms or the hard brightness of high summer, but something quieter than both of those. A pale, clean light that had no anger in it. The kind of light that falls on things as they actually are without embellishment or softening and finds them sufficient. When it reached the flat ground and spread westward across the pale grass and touched the cabin walls and the fence line and the faces of the few Comanche men still keeping their quiet vigil at the edge of the property, it fell on a different arrangement of things than it had left the evening before. Conrad Pell was arrested in Amarillo 6 weeks later on charges that Marcus Webb had constructed with the methodical patience of someone who is very good at his work and is working on something that matters to him. The charges were numerous, and the evidence was substantial, drawn from the document Jasper had carried for 4 years, from the Reverend's testimony, from statements given by Taka's 4 riders, and from a separate investigation that Webb initiated into the financial records of Pell's bank, which revealed a pattern of debt structuring specifically designed to produce property forfeitures in the aftermath of manufactured crises. The trial took 4 months. Pell was convicted on 7 counts. The debt on Jasper's property was among those that the court voided, having been issued by an institution operating in violation of territorial banking law. Jasper received the deed to his land clear and unencumbered on a Wednesday afternoon in November, delivered by Frank Oates, who drove out from the settlement in a wagon rather than riding because his horse had thrown a shoe that morning, and also because the occasion seemed to him to warrant a slightly different mode of approach than a routine official visit. Oates handed Jasper the deed and stood beside his wagon for a moment without getting back in. He was not a man who used words generously, and he did not use many now. "The report I filed on the night this started," he said. "I filed it the next morning, not in the window I gave you. The next morning." He looked at the deed in Jasper's hand. "I told myself it was procedure. It was not entirely procedure." "I know," Jasper said. "I'm going to try to be less interested in procedure when procedure is a way of not choosing," Oates said. He nodded once, the nod of a man making a commitment to himself in front of a witness, and then he got back in the wagon and drove east. Marcus Webb established a permanent office in the settlement before the year was out. His practice was from the beginning unusual for the territory in that he accepted clients from both settler and Comanche communities, a practice that caused him some professional difficulty, and that he continued anyway, citing a legal principle that he articulated to anyone who challenged him, with the patient clarity of someone who has thought carefully about something and is not interested in pretending the thought leads somewhere other than where it leads. Clem Briggs's wife Alma recovered. Not completely. Not in the way that a story tidied into pure satisfaction would have her recover, but sufficiently gradually in the way that real recovery happens unpredictably and partially and with setbacks. Until by the following spring, she was well enough to come outside in the mornings and sit on the steps of their cabin and watch the light change, which she had not been able to do for 2 years. Clem did not speak of the night of the confrontation to anyone, which Jasper understood. Some things are settled internally and do not require external accounting. Stonehawk did not come to Jasper's ranch. Jasper had not expected him to, and would not have known what to do with it if he had. What Stonehawk did, which Jasper learned of through Taka some months later, was take on a particular role in his community as an intermediary, someone who would speak to both Comanche and settler concerns in the ongoing practical negotiations over land and water and passage rights that continued always in the background of everything else. He was not a diplomat in any formal sense. He was a man who had decided to do something specific with what he knew about the damage that silence causes, and he did it with the same directness he brought to everything else. Reverend Tunney read his sermon on a Sunday in September. Half the congregation walked out. The other half stayed, and in the weeks following the half that stayed had conversations they had not had before, and some of the half that walked out came back the following Sunday, and some did not. The Reverend counted neither outcome as a success or a failure. He counted the saying of it as the thing that needed to happen and let the results be what they were. In the spring of the following year, a girl on a small horse appeared at the north edge of Jasper's property on a morning in April, when the light was doing its particular best, and the thin grass had gone briefly green the way it does in spring before the summer heat returns it to gold. She rode easily the way of someone who has grown up on horseback, and for whom the horse is simply an extension of moving through the world, rather than a specific mode of transport. Jasper was at the fence line replacing a post that had heaved over the winter, the same work he had been doing on the morning she first arrived, which he noted when she pulled up her horse at the fence and looked at him with the same evaluating eyes, larger now in a face that had begun to lose some of the childhood roundness, beginning the long transformation into the face she would have when she was grown. She had brought something tied to her saddle in a piece of cloth. She untied it and held it out across the fence, and when Jasper took it, he found it was a cloth bundle containing dried meat and a small clay jar sealed with wax, and something else at the bottom wrapped in a separate piece of fabric. He unwrapped the fabric and found a small carved figure, smooth and palm-sized, made from dark wood. A man and a child standing together, rendered in the simple, deliberate style of something made by hand for a specific purpose. He turned it in his hands. Wren watched him look at it from her side of the fence. "I made it," she said. Her English was better than it had been worked over the winter by the same stubborn application she brought to everything. "It is not perfect. I will make a better one when I am older and my hands are steadier." Jasper looked at the carved figures for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I have been calling you Wren," he said, "in my head, since the first day." He paused. "I did not know what else to call you." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I know," she said. "My father told me." A brief pause. "My name is Pia." She said it the Comanche way, 2 clean syllables, the first one short and the second one open. "It means something like younger sister. My mother chose it." Jasper said it once quietly to hear how it sat in his mouth. "Pia." She nodded once, satisfied. Then she looked at the carved figures in his hands. "You can call me either one," she said with the particular generosity of someone who has decided a thing is not worth fighting about. "Wren is also a bird. My father says birds go where they need to go and do not explain themselves." She tilted her head slightly. "I think that is acceptable." Jasper looked at the small carved figures for a long moment. He thought about the folded paper that was no longer in his pocket, that was in a leather case in a lawyer's office doing the work it should have been doing years ago. He thought about the photograph on the table which was still there, which he still replaced the dried flowers beside each week without fail. He thought about 47 days that had become no days, the debt lifted and the land clear, and the markers at the east edge of the property exactly where he had built them. He looked at the girl on the other side of the fence. "It is perfect," he said. He meant the carved figure. He also meant something larger than the carved figure, and they both understood this without it needing to be said. She shook her head. "Not yet," she said with the absolute certainty of someone who knows the difference between what is and what it is going to become. "But it will be. She turned her horse and rode west. Jasper stood at the fence line with the carved figure in his hands and watched her go, growing smaller against the enormous Texas sky until she was a shape and then a suggestion and then gone, and the panhandle went on in every direction, flat and pale and permanent. The same land it had always been, holding everything that had happened on it and everything that was still to come, with the equal indifference of earth and time. He put the carved figure in his shirt pocket next to where the paper had been. He picked up the post driver. He went back to work.